He mocked her in front of everyone, thinking she was just another nobody. But the next day, she walked into his office as his new boss. Now, the tables have turned, and he's about to learn a lesson he'll never forget. Section 1. The grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel glittered under the brilliance of 1,000 chandeliers, the soft hum of classical music blending seamlessly with the murmurs of high society elites. The annual charity gala was an event where power was flaunted, alliances were formed, and reputations were made, or broken. Lucas Reed, heir to Reed Enterprises, stood near the bar, his signature smirk plastered across his face. Dressed in a custom Armani tux, he exuded effortless charm, the kind that made women swoon and men envy him. He had spent years cultivating his reputation as the golden boy of the business world, reckless, arrogant, but undeniably brilliant. "Who is that?" One of his friends nudged him, motioning toward a woman across the room. Lucas followed his gaze, mildly intrigued. She wasn't one of the usual socialites he entertained. No designer labels, no desperate attempts to cling to men like him. She wore a simple yet elegant black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, her dark brown hair cascading in soft waves. But what stood out the most was her presence, confident, poised, as if she belonged among the powerful men and women in the room, despite being an outsider. "Looks out of place," one of his acquaintances snorted. "She's probably some assistant who snuck in." Lucas took a sip of his whiskey, his lips curving into a wicked grin. "Let's have some fun." His friends chuckled, watching as he made his way toward her. "Enjoying the view?" Lucas drawled as he approached. The woman turned her head slightly, her deep brown eyes locking onto his with an expression of mild boredom. "Excuse me?" Lucas smirked, tilting his head. "You seem a little lost." Her lips twitched, amusement flickering in her gaze. "And you seem a little too self-assured for someone who just made a ridiculous assumption." His friends, who had gathered nearby to watch, let out quiet chuckles. Lucas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Careful, sweetheart. You don't want to embarrass yourself in front of all these people." The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her glass to her lips and took a slow sip before setting it down with deliberate grace. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you." The crowd around them let out a few murmurs of interest, sensing the tension between them. Lucas, enjoying the attention, decided to push further. "I admire the confidence," he mused, eyes gleaming with mischief. "But tell me, whose +1 are you? Or did you sneak in hoping to find yourself a rich husband?" A quiet hush fell over the nearby guests. The woman's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but her expression remained composed. "Is that the best insult you can come up with?" "I expected something more original from a man who enjoys humiliating people for sport." His smirk didn't waver. "Oh, I don't do it for sport, I do it for entertainment." Her gaze darkened slightly, but instead of lashing out, she did something that completely caught him off guard. She smiled. It wasn't forced, it wasn't fake, it was the kind of smile that sent a chill down his spine. "Well then," she said, setting her drink down, "I hope you enjoyed yourself, Mr. Reed." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with the distinct feeling that he had just made a very, very big mistake. The next morning, Lucas strolled into Reed Enterprises, still reveling in the triumph of last night's party. It had been a typical evening. Expensive champagne, attractive women, and a game or two of power plays. But as he stepped into the sleek glass lobby of the company, something felt off. The employees, usually quick to greet him with forced politeness, seemed tense. Whispers rippled through the halls, and people exchanged nervous glances. Lucas frowned. "What the hell is going on?" His assistant, Claire, rushed toward him, her face pale. "Mr. Reed, you need to get to the executive conference room, now." Lucas arched a brow. "And why is that?" Before she could answer, the elevator doors dinged open, and a figure stepped out. Lucas's breath caught. It was her, the woman from last night, but this time she wasn't wearing a cocktail dress. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek bun. Her stride was powerful, confident, commanding, and as she walked past him, she didn't even spare him a glance. Lucas turned to Claire, his pulse quickening. "Who the hell is that?" Claire swallowed hard. "Your new boss." Lucas froze, his ears rang with the words. "New boss?" Before he could process what was happening, the doors to the executive conference room swung open, and the entire board of directors stood up in unison. At the head of the long, polished mahogany table, She took a seat, crossing one leg over the other, exuding a level of authority that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said smoothly, her voice carrying effortlessly. "Let's get started." Lucas barely registered the board members murmuring their greetings, because all he could hear was the deafening realization crashing down on him. The woman he had humiliated last night wasn't just some nobody. She was Isabella Carter, and she was now the CEO of his company. Section 2. Lucas remained frozen in the doorway, staring at Isabella as if she had just announced the end of the world. The board members shuffled in their seats, their gazes darting between him and the woman now occupying the most powerful chair in the room. The sheer audacity of it all made his pulse hammer. Isabella Carter, his new boss, the same woman he had humiliated in front of half the city's elite just last night. She leaned back in her chair, perfectly composed, her manicured fingers tapping idly against the polished mahogany table. "Lucas," she said smoothly, her voice laced with amusement, "are you going to join us? Or do you prefer standing in the doorway looking like you've seen a ghost?" A quiet chuckle rippled through the boardroom. Lucas gritted his teeth. "Recover." He forced a smirk, straightened his shoulders, and strode inside, settling into his usual chair, the one directly across from hers. If she thought she could rattle him, she had another thing coming. "This is unexpected," he drawled, feigning indifference. "You should have told me you'd be taking over. We could have gotten better acquainted last night." Isabella arched a brow, unbothered. "Oh, I think we got acquainted enough." Another round of stifled laughter. Lucas shot a glare at the board members. What the hell was wrong with them? They were treating her like royalty when he had been the one practically running this company for years. Sure, he wasn't officially in charge, but his father had always made it clear that Lucas was next in line. Until now, apparently. He turned back to Isabella, his smirk sharpening. "Tell me, how exactly did you land this job? I don't remember seeing your name on the list of candidates." Her lips curled into a knowing smile, the kind that made his stomach tighten for reasons he didn't want to acknowledge. "I didn't need to apply," she said simply. "I bought it." The room fell into a stunned silence. Lucas blinked. "You... what?" Isabella folded her hands on the table, her expression cool. "Reed Enterprises has been struggling for the past few years, hasn't it? Slipping stock prices, shaky investor confidence. Your father saw the writing on the wall. So when I made him an offer, one that would not only save the company but guarantee a stronger future, he took it." Lucas clenched his fists under the table. "My father wouldn't." "He did," she cut in smoothly. "I now own 51% of Reed Enterprises." Lucas's blood ran cold. 51%. She had controlling interest. His father had given her controlling interest. He barely heard the rest of what she was saying, as the weight of the betrayal settled in. This company was supposed to be his. He had spent his entire life preparing for this, working under his father's wing, handling acquisitions, negotiating deals, everything that should have made him the obvious successor. And yet, without so much as a warning, his father had sold it right out from under him. To her. Lucas forced his jaw to unclench. "So what now?" he asked, his voice edged with mockery. "Are you here to fix us, Isabella? Going to whip us all into shape?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "That depends," she said. "Can you handle working for a woman? Or will your ego get in the way?" Lucas inhaled slowly through his nose. This woman was good. Too good. He couldn't let her see how much this rattled him. With practiced ease, he leaned back in his chair and flashed her a slow, lazy grin. "Oh, I can handle you just fine, sweetheart." A flicker of something flashed in her gaze. Annoyance, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She turned back to the board members. "Let's get to work." Lucas spent the rest of the meeting not listening. He watched her instead, taking in the way she commanded the room with ease, the way even the most senior board members seemed to hang on to her every word. She was sharp, articulate, and annoyingly good at this. This wasn't just some rich girl playing CEO. She knew what she was doing. That was the worst part. By the time the meeting adjourned, Lucas was already formulating a plan. If she thought she could waltz in here and take over his company, she had another thing coming. He waited until the room cleared, leaving just the two of them. Isabella glanced up from the papers she was gathering. "Still here?" Lucas walked over, resting his hands on the back of a chair. "I have to say," he murmured, "I wasn't expecting this." She hummed. "No, I imagine you weren't." Lucas smirked. Tell me, did you enjoy yourself last night? Letting me make a fool of myself before dropping this bombshell today? She arched a brow. Do you think I planned that? He narrowed his eyes. Didn't you? She tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence. Now, Lucas, what kind of person do you think I am? The kind that played games. The kind that didn't back down from a challenge. The kind that was going to make his life very, very difficult. He exhaled slowly. All right, boss, he said, the word laced with mockery. What's your first order of business? Isabella tapped her chin in mock thought. Well, for starters, I need to assess the team. Figure out who's actually adding value and who's just coasting. Lucas chuckled. And where do I fall? Her gaze flickered with amusement. Oh, you're definitely coasting. He let out a low laugh. Ouch. I'm not here to stroke egos, Lucas, she said simply, gathering her things. If you want to stay, you're going to have to prove you belong here. Lucas watched as she made her way toward the door. See you tomorrow, she called over her shoulder. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. He had been prepared to hate her, but damn, she was making it really hard to look away. Section 3. Lucas paced his penthouse that night, frustration burning in his chest. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid as the city lights sprawled beneath him. Isabella Carter, his new boss. It didn't make sense. He had spent years preparing for this moment, proving himself in every way, knowing that one day he'd take over Reed Enterprises. Then his father had sold the company. Sold it to a woman Lucas had humiliated in front of the entire city. He clenched his jaw at the memory, the way she had looked at him, not with anger but with amusement, as if she had known all along how this would play out. Lucas took a slow sip of his drink, his thoughts twisting into something darker. This wasn't just about business. This was personal, and if she thought he was going to roll over and let her take everything from him, she had another thing coming. The next morning, Lucas strode into the office early. He wasn't about to let her get the upper hand. Not again. He walked past the usual admiring glances from the female employees, flashing them his signature smirk, but his mind was elsewhere. When he stepped into his office, he froze. The walls were bare. His sleek modern desk, once filled with personal touches, was empty. Even the custom chair he had imported from Italy was gone. His entire office had been stripped down. Rage bubbled inside him as he stormed down the hallway toward Isabella's office. He pushed open the door without knocking. Isabella barely looked up from her desk. Good morning, Lucas. He slammed the door shut behind him. Where the hell is my office? She flipped a page in her notebook, completely unbothered. Oh, that. Yes, that, he snapped. She leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. I had it cleaned out. Lucas clenched his fists. And why would you do that? She tilted her head, feigning innocence. Because, Lucas, as far as I can tell, you don't have a position here yet. His breath caught. What the hell are you talking about? I'm restructuring the company, she said, tapping her pen against her notebook. Reevaluating roles, eliminating unnecessary positions. Unnecessary, Lucas interrupted, his voice rising. She smiled sweetly. Oh, don't look so offended. You've had a free ride here for years. Your father made sure of that. But now that I own the company, things are changing. Lucas gritted his teeth. And what exactly am I supposed to do in the meantime? Her lips curved into a slow, almost cruel smirk. I have a new role for you, she said. I assumed you wouldn't want to leave, so I reassigned you. Lucas narrowed his eyes. To what? Her smirk widened. You're now working as my assistant. A heavy silence settled between them. Lucas stared at her, his brain struggling to process the words. Then he let out a low, humorless laugh. You're kidding. Not at all. She gestured toward the chair in front of her desk. Sit. Lucas didn't move. She sighed, placing her pen down. You wanted a place in this company? Prove you deserve it. Otherwise, there's the door. Lucas inhaled sharply, his entire body coiled with frustration. But he wasn't about to let her win. With forced casualness, he walked over and dropped into the chair. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes. Something like satisfaction. Lucas felt the flicker of a dangerous game beginning between them, and he wasn't sure who was going to win. The day was hell. Lucas had been on the executive team for years, managing million-dollar accounts, handling mergers. Now he was fetching coffee. He sat in the open workspace outside Isabella's office, watching emails flood in. His inbox, once filled with high-stakes negotiations, was now filled with meeting schedules and reminders to pick up dry cleaning. Dry cleaning. He was Lucas Reed, one of the most sought-after names in business. Women wanted him. Men envied him. And now he was picking up lattes. A notification popped up on his screen. New task from Isabella Carter. Book my dinner reservation for 8 p.m. Lucas's jaw ticked. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could quit, he could walk out, call his father, demand answers. But something held him back. Pride. The need to prove himself. The need to show Isabella that no matter what she threw at him, he wouldn't break. So he gritted his teeth and typed out the confirmation. When he walked into Isabella's office hours later, she barely looked up. "All set?" she asked. Lucas dropped the folder onto her desk. "Your dinner reservation is confirmed, your schedule is updated, and your dry cleaning is in your office." She glanced up at him then, her lips twitching slightly. How efficient. Lucas leaned forward, resting his hands on her desk. "Careful, boss," he murmured. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were enjoying this." Her gaze flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, I am," she admitted. Lucas laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." She shrugged. "You did say you could handle me, didn't you?" Lucas clenched his jaw. He had walked right into that one, but two could play this game. He straightened up, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Enjoy your dinner, boss." Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out. He could feel her eyes on him as he left, and he smirked. Because this wasn't over, not even close. Section 4. Lucas sat in his new office, if it could even be called that. It wasn't an office so much as a corner desk outside Isabella's door, shoved into a space meant for a low-level intern. It was humiliating. He had spent years proving himself, making connections, building a reputation. Now, he was sorting files and responding to calendar invites. Lucas's jaw ticked as he scrolled through his inbox, seeing one humiliating task after another. New task from Isabella Carter. Confirm the floral arrangements for the investor gala. Lucas exhaled sharply. Floral arrangements. This woman was playing with him. He was Lucas Reed and he was ordering roses and peonies. But the worst part, he couldn't walk away. Not yet. He had to prove himself, and more than that, he had to make her crack first. So instead of throwing his computer across the room like he wanted to, he picked up the phone and called the event planner. 30 minutes later, the order was finalized, and he sent Isabella an email confirmation with a perfectly polite tone. But deep down, something twisted inside him. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was war. At lunchtime, Lucas stood in front of the espresso machine in the executive lounge, watching the rich liquid drip into the pristine cup. He heard footsteps behind him, and didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "I assume you've handled the flowers?" Isabella's voice was cool and effortless, the way it always was when she spoke to him. Lucas took his time before turning, stirring a single sugar cube into his coffee. "Every petal accounted for." She raised an eyebrow. "Impressive." Lucas smirked. "I aim to please." Something flickered in her gaze, but she didn't let it linger. Instead, she lifted her own coffee cup and took a sip. Then, casually, she said, "By the way, I need you to accompany me to the investor gala tonight." Lucas nearly choked on his coffee. "Excuse me." "I need a date," she said simply. "And since you're technically my assistant, you're the obvious choice." Lucas laughed. He wasn't sure what part was funnier, the idea of him being her assistant, or the fact that she actually expected him to play along. "I'm not a babysitter," he said, crossing his arms. She gave him an indifferent look. "No, but you are my employee, and I'd hate for you to be seen as expendable." Lucas narrowed his eyes. It was a threat wrapped neatly in a polite sentence. He could refuse, but she would make him regret it. So he exhaled, setting down his coffee cup. "Fine, but don't expect me to play the perfect assistant all night." Her lips twitched slightly, as if she found that amusing. "Oh, Lucas," she murmured. "I never expected you to be perfect at anything." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Lucas standing there, gripping his coffee like a lifeline. That night, Lucas stood outside the grand ballroom of the most exclusive hotel in the city, adjusting the sleeves of his tailored suit. He was used to these events. High-profile investors, high-stakes conversations, the constant game of power and influence. But tonight, something felt different. And when Isabella stepped out of the car, he understood why. She was stunning. A sleek black dress hugged her frame, her dark hair styled in elegant waves. The diamond earrings she wore sparkled under the chandelier lights as she walked toward him with the same effortless grace she carried in the boardroom. Lucas barely recognized her. For a split second, he forgot why he hated her. Then she smirked. "Try not to look too shocked, Lucas." He rolled his shoulders, pushing down whatever the hell he had just felt. "I'm just wondering how many bodies you had to step over to get that dress." She let out a soft laugh. "I don't step over people, Lucas. I just win." And just like that, the moment was over. Lucas offered his arm and she took it without hesitation. As they walked into the gala, all eyes turned toward them. He heard the whispers before they even reached their table. Lucas Reed? Working for her? He was supposed to take over Reed Enterprises. How did this happen? They hate each other, don't they? Lucas smirked. If only they knew. The evening was predictably dull. Investors shook hands, sipped champagne, and talked about numbers. Lucas played his part, standing beside Isabella, nodding when necessary, offering fake smiles. But then, something changed. At one point, as Isabella spoke to a group of investors, Lucas noticed something off. A man in his 60s, dressed in a tailored navy suit, was watching her too closely. Not in the way investors watched potential partners, in the way predators watched prey. Lucas's jaw tightened. The man leaned in slightly as Isabella spoke, his fingers brushing against her wrist under the guise of casual conversation. Isabella didn't react. She was too composed for that, but Lucas saw the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Before he even thought about it, Lucas stepped forward. With a smooth, easy movement, he placed a hand on Isabella's lower back, just enough to stake his claim. The older man looked up, startled, as Lucas smiled. "Everything all right here, boss?" he asked smoothly. Isabella glanced at him, and for the first time ever, he saw a flicker of something that looked like relief. She played along effortlessly. "Of course," she said, but her eyes held something unspoken. Lucas turned back to the man, his smile cool but dangerous. "Good. I'd hate for anyone to be out of line tonight." The man muttered something and quickly excused himself. As soon as he was gone, Isabella turned to Lucas, her voice low. "What the hell was that?" Lucas shrugged. "Just being a good assistant." She gave him a long, unreadable look. Then quietly she said, "Thank you." And for some reason, Lucas felt like he had lost this round. Later that night, after the gala, Lucas walked Isabella to her car. She leaned against the door, arms crossed. "I have to say, Lucas," she mused, "you make a surprisingly decent date." Lucas smirked. "Was that a compliment?" She tilted her head. "Don't get used to it." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Then, in a softer voice, she said, "Why did you step in tonight?" Lucas met her gaze. For once, there was no smugness in her expression, no arrogance, just a quiet question. He hesitated. "Because I didn't like the way he looked at you. Because I know what it feels like to be surrounded by people but still feel alone." But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he shrugged. "Just being professional." She studied him for a long time. Then, with a small, knowing smirk, she opened her car door. "Good night, Lucas." As she drove away, Lucas exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. Because for the first time since this entire mess had started, he realized something very dangerous. This wasn't just war anymore, it was something else entirely. Section 5. Lucas arrived at the office the next morning, expecting things to return to their usual rhythm. Isabella making his life miserable, him pushing back with sharp comments and stubborn defiance. But something had changed after the gala. He didn't know what it was exactly, but it was there. Maybe it was the moment in the ballroom, when he saw her tense under another man's touch. Maybe it was the look in her eyes when he stepped in. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, she had actually said thank you. Regardless of what it was, he felt it. And he could tell she did too. Because when Isabella walked into the office, she didn't meet his gaze right away. She was dressed as perfectly as always. A tailored navy blazer over a silk blouse, heels that clicked against the marble floor with confidence. But there was something different in her expression. Less sharp, less ruthless, more hesitant. Lucas smirked. That was interesting. She set her bag down, flipping open her laptop. After a moment, she finally looked up. "Your next assignment." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "And what degrading task do you have for me today? Picking out your shoes for the next board meeting? Fetching your dry cleaning?" Isabella didn't react to his sarcasm. Instead, she slid a folder across the desk. I need you to handle the next round of negotiations for the Carter deal. Lucas blinked. Wait, he sat up. What? You heard me, she said, adjusting her watch. You have experience with Carter Industries. I want you to take point on this round of negotiations. Lucas frowned, flipping open the file. This wasn't busy work. This was a real assignment, one that actually mattered. For a moment he was suspicious. Was this some kind of trap? Some elaborate way to humiliate him? But when he glanced back up, Isabella was already busy typing on her laptop, not sparing him another glance. His jaw ticked. Fine, he could do this, he would do this, and he would do it so well that she wouldn't have any choice but to admit he was more than just an assistant. That afternoon, Lucas sat in the conference room, drumming his fingers against the table as he waited for the Carter Industries team to arrive. He had spent years dealing with high-profile clients. He knew how these meetings worked. The door swung open and the Carter representative stepped inside. Lucas stood extending a hand to the lead negotiator. Mr. Callahan, nice to see you again. Callahan shook his hand with a polite nod. Likewise, I have to admit I was expecting Ms. Carter to lead this meeting. Lucas smirked. She's a busy woman. Callahan chuckled. Aren't we all? The negotiations began and Lucas fell into his usual rhythm. He dissected proposals, countered offers, pushed back when necessary. He thrived in this kind of setting. It reminded him of who he was before all this, before Isabella, before the humiliation, before he was shoved into the role of a glorified assistant. 2 hours later, the meeting wrapped up, and Lucas stood, shaking Callahan's hand again. I'll have our legal team review the contract adjustments, Callahan said, but I have to admit I'm impressed. You handled that well. Lucas smirked. I try. When he returned to Isabella's office, he tossed the signed agreements onto her desk. All done. She glanced at the papers, then back at him. That was fast. Lucas shrugged. I'm efficient. A pause, then to his surprise, Isabella smiled slightly. Good work. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? She didn't answer, but he saw the ghost of a smirk as she turned back to her laptop. And for some reason, it made his stomach tighten. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Lucas kept waiting for things to go back to normal, for Isabella to throw another impossible task at him, for her to push him out like she had before. But that didn't happen. Instead, she kept giving him real work. More high-level tasks, more responsibilities. And Lucas, despite himself, enjoyed it. He enjoyed proving himself. He enjoyed the challenge, and, though he'd never admit it, he enjoyed the late nights in the office, working alongside Isabella. It was something about the way she focused when she was deep into a project, the way she pushed her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way her fingers tapped against the desk when she was reading a contract. She was still infuriating, still as competitive as ever, but Lucas found himself watching her more than he should, not just out of spite. Not just to win, but because he was starting to care, and that was a problem. One evening, Lucas was still in his office long after most of the staff had left. He was reviewing financial reports when he heard a voice from the doorway. Still here? He looked up to see Isabella leaning against the frame, arms crossed. Lucas smirked. You sound surprised. She stepped inside, moving to his desk. I'm not. I know you don't quit easily. Lucas leaned back in his chair. Is that another compliment? She rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. Instead, she glanced at the reports on his desk. Carter deal updates? Yeah. There's a clause in their contract that could cause issues down the line. I was going to bring it up in the next meeting. She studied the document, her brow furrowing slightly. Lucas watched her, something stirring in his chest. It was so strange, so unexpected. There was a time when he wanted nothing more than to humiliate her the way she had humiliated him. But now he just wanted to understand her, and maybe, just maybe, he wanted her to understand him too. The next night, the company held a corporate event, a formal gathering for board members and executives. Lucas arrived in a sharp black suit, expecting the usual routine. But when Isabella walked in, everything shifted. She was breathtaking. Her dress was deep emerald, highlighting her sharp features, her confidence, her power. Lucas wasn't the only one staring. Every man in the room turned to look at her, but for some reason that pissed him off, especially when a young executive from another firm approached her, offering a smooth, flirtatious smile. Lucas clenched his jaw. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself it didn't matter. But then Isabella laughed, soft, effortless, and something inside him snapped. Before he could stop himself, he crossed the room and cut in. "Mind if I steal my boss for a moment?" Lucas asked, voice smooth. The other man hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside. Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Jealous?" Lucas smirked. "Just doing my job." She gave him a knowing look. "Is that all it is?" Lucas didn't answer, because for the first time since this all began, he wasn't so sure anymore. And the worst part? Neither was she. Section 6. Lucas had no idea when things had shifted so drastically between them. It wasn't long ago that he had been plotting ways to make her life miserable, finding satisfaction in every small inconvenience he could throw her way. But now he found himself noticing things he had no business noticing, like the way she ran her fingers along the rim of her coffee mug when she was deep in thought, or how her lips curved slightly whenever she figured out a solution to a complex problem, or how, despite the way she tormented him daily, she never actually crossed the line, never gave him a task that was beneath him, never disrespected him in front of clients, never treated him like he was insignificant, which was strange, because if he were in her position, if he were the one with the upper hand, he would have destroyed her without hesitation. And yet, Isabella Carter had done nothing of the sort. She challenged him, she pushed him, she made his life infuriating, but she never tried to break him, and that realization made him see her in a way he never had before. The morning after the gala, Lucas arrived at the office earlier than usual, coffee in hand, already bracing himself for whatever chaos the day would bring. But when he stepped into his office, he froze, because sitting on his desk was an envelope. It was crisp, unmarked, with only his name written in neat, familiar handwriting. Lucas frowned, setting down his coffee before picking up the envelope. His fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before he pulled it open. Inside was a letter, and the moment he started reading, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a resignation notice, it wasn't a warning or an order. It was a request. A single, uncharacteristically vulnerable request from Isabella Carter. "Lucas, I need your help. Meet me in my office at noon." Isabella, that was it. No details, no explanations. Just 6 simple words that sent a strange, unsettling sensation rippling through him. Because Isabella Carter never asked for help. And if she was now, then whatever was happening had to be serious. At exactly noon, Lucas knocked on the door to Isabella's office. "Come in." Her voice was steady, but when he stepped inside, he immediately noticed the tightness in her expression, the way her fingers curled slightly against the edge of her desk. Lucas shut the door behind him. "Well," he said casually, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day where Isabella Carter admits she needs me." She shot him a glare. "I don't need you," she said, but there was no bite in her tone. "I need someone who can think fast and handle a crisis without making a scene." Lucas arched a brow. "And that someone is me?" She let out a slow breath, standing up and walking around her desk. "I just got word that our biggest investor, James Blackwood, is reconsidering his partnership with the company." Lucas frowned. "Blackwood, that doesn't make sense. His deal with Carter Enterprises is one of the most stable agreements in the industry." Isabella nodded. "Which is exactly why I need you to help me figure out what changed." Lucas studied her. The tension in her jaw, the flicker of something uncertain in her usually sharp eyes. Then it clicked. This wasn't just about business, and this was personal. Blackwood wasn't just some investor. He was someone who held power over Isabella in a way she wasn't comfortable with. And that was why she had come to him. Lucas had spent years navigating the world of high-stakes corporate politics. He could see through manipulation like it was second nature. So, without another word, he nodded. "All right," he said, "tell me everything." That evening they arrived at the exclusive Blackwood Gala, an invitation-only event that was as much about power as it was about business. Lucas had been to events like this before. They were filled with people who had too much money and not enough morals, and Isabella knew that better than anyone. She was stiff beside him, her posture flawless, her confidence as untouchable as ever, but he saw it. The way her fingers twitched slightly against her clutch, the way her gaze flickered around the room, scanning the crowd for something, or someone. Lucas stepped closer. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice low. Isabella exhaled through her nose. "James Blackwood." Lucas's eyes followed hers, landing on a man across the room, a middle-aged billionaire with an arrogant smirk and too much power in his expression. Lucas immediately disliked him. Blackwood was talking to a group of executives, swirling a glass of whiskey in one hand, while the other rested too casually on the arm of a young assistant. Lucas's jaw ticked. "Let me guess," he murmured. "He thinks he owns you." Isabella didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. Lucas took a slow breath. "All right," he said, straightening his jacket. "Let's go make him regret ever trying to cross you." Isabella blinked, turning to him. "What?" Lucas smirked. "You brought me here for a reason, didn't you?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Good," he said. "Because if this bastard thinks he can intimidate you, he's about to learn exactly who he's dealing with." Isabella let out a short, breathless laugh. And Lucas? Lucas realized something. He would burn the whole damn room down before he let anyone threaten her. They approached Blackwood's group, and Lucas immediately took charge of the conversation. He was charming, effortlessly smooth, seamlessly weaving himself into the discussion as if he belonged there. But he was also calculating. He watched Blackwood's expressions, his reactions, the way he looked at Isabella, like she was something to be controlled, something to be kept in check. Lucas felt something dark coil in his chest. He wanted to wipe that smirk off the bastard's face, so he did what he did best. He played the game. He talked numbers, investments, made subtle comments that challenged Blackwood's authority without outright disrespecting him. And slowly, Blackwood started to crack. By the end of the conversation, he was visibly irritated, his smugness faltering. Lucas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for only Blackwood to hear. "If you're thinking about pulling out of Carter Enterprises," he murmured, "you might want to reconsider." Blackwood stiffened. "Is that a threat?" Lucas smirked. "It's a warning." Blackwood's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. He just turned away, and Lucas knew they had won. Later that night, as they walked out of the gala, Isabella exhaled sharply. "That was—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "That was incredible." Lucas smirked. "I know." She rolled her eyes, but then she turned to him, her expression softer. "I mean it," she said quietly. "Thank you." Lucas hesitated, his smirk fading slightly. He wanted to say something clever, something casual, but instead he just nodded. And for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a rivalry anymore. It was something else entirely. And that scared him more than anything. Section 7. Lucas wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but it had. Somewhere between their sharp exchanges, their battles of wit, and their constant one-upping, something changed. He used to see Isabella as his enemy, a roadblock in his life, someone he wanted to fight against. But now he wasn't so sure, because instead of resentment he felt respect. Instead of seeing her as the woman who ruined his life, he saw her as someone who had built her own life from the ground up. And instead of wanting to bring her down, he wanted to know who she really was. The morning after the gala, Lucas expected things to go back to normal. He figured Isabella would walk into the office like she always did, with her perfect posture and icy composure, pretending like nothing had happened. But when he saw her, something felt different. She wasn't avoiding him, she wasn't brushing him off, she just looked at him differently, like she was still trying to figure out why he had helped her. Lucas didn't bring it up, but he knew they were both thinking the same thing. This is no longer just a game. The tension between them grew, but not in the way it used to. Before, their rivalry had been about winning. Now it felt like they were dancing around something neither of them could name. Lucas found himself watching her too closely, noticing the way she tapped her pen against the desk when she was thinking, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was about to disagree with someone, the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she was holding back something she really wanted to say, and the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. Not all the time, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Lucas noticed, and it was driving him insane. One evening, long after the office had emptied out, Lucas was still at his desk. He had no real reason to stay, but he also wasn't ready to go home, because home was empty. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be alone. A knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up, and his breath hitched. Isabella was standing there. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Lucas straightened. "What's up, boss?" he teased, but his voice lacked its usual bite. Isabella didn't roll her eyes, she just studied him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she let out a slow breath. "I don't get you," she admitted. Lucas blinked. "Excuse me? You," she said. "I don't understand you." She walked closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "1 minute, you're impossible. You challenge me at every turn. You make my job harder than it needs to be." Lucas smirked. "In my defense, you started it." Isabella ignored him. "And then," she continued, "the next minute you're standing by my side, helping me, defending me, looking at me like—" She stopped. Lucas felt his pulse kick up. "Like what?" he asked, his voice lower than before. Isabella shook her head. "Like you're not supposed to," she said quietly. Lucas felt something in his chest tighten, because she was right. He wasn't supposed to look at her like that, but he did. And he had no idea what to do about it. They were too close now. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Lucas wanted to say something. He wanted to make a joke, turn this moment into something less intense, something he could walk away from. But he couldn't, because Isabella was looking at him differently. And for the first time since they met, Lucas realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as indifferent as she pretended to be. He could see it. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. She was fighting this just as much as he was, and it was killing them both. Then, suddenly, Isabella stepped back. Just like that, the moment was over. She cleared her throat, shifting her gaze away. "This was a mistake," she muttered. Lucas exhaled slowly, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "What was?" he asked, keeping his voice light. "Talking to me? Or almost—" "Don't," she cut in, her tone sharp. Lucas raised a brow. "Don't what?" Isabella clenched her jaw. "Don't act like this is something it's not." Lucas stared at her, and that was when he realized the truth. She wasn't just pushing him away. She was scared. Scared of what this was turning into, scared of what it meant, scared of letting her guard down, not just with him but with anyone. Lucas could have walked away. He could have laughed it off, acted like none of this mattered. But he didn't. Because it did matter, and for the first time in his life, Lucas wasn't afraid to admit that. The next few days were tense. They avoided each other as much as possible. Meetings were strictly professional. Conversations were short. But the silence between them, it was louder than ever. Lucas hated it. He hated pretending like that night hadn't happened. He hated pretending like he didn't feel something every time he looked at her. And he hated that she was doing the same thing. So, finally, after 3 days of acting like strangers, Lucas had had enough. He knocked on Isabella's office door. She looked up from her desk, clearly surprised. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone too neutral. Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he closed the door, walked up to her desk, and sat on the edge of it, arms crossed. Isabella sighed. "Lucas, why are you pretending like nothing happened?" he interrupted, her fingers stilled against her laptop. "Because nothing did," she said. Lucas let out a humorless laugh. "Right," he muttered. "Of course nothing happened." Isabella said nothing. Lucas leaned in slightly. "But tell me something, Isabella," he murmured. "If nothing happened, why can't you even look at me right now?" She froze. Lucas smirked, but it wasn't cocky this time. It was soft, because he knew the truth now. She felt it too, she just didn't want to admit it. And that made him want to fight for her even more. Section 8. Lucas had always been able to read people. It was one of his greatest strengths. In business, it gave him an edge. He could tell when someone was bluffing, when they were hiding something, when they were just seconds away from breaking under pressure. But when it came to Isabella, every instinct he had, every skill he relied on, failed him. Because Isabella wasn't like anyone else. She was a walking contradiction, fierce yet composed, ruthless yet kind, distant yet unbearably close. And now, as she sat across from him, arms folded, eyes locked onto her laptop as if it held the secrets of the universe, Lucas realized he had never met anyone so impossible to figure out. Which was why, for the first time in his life, he didn't care about winning. He just wanted the truth. And he was going to get it. The office was empty. It was late, past midnight, but Lucas was still there, sitting at his desk, staring at his untouched whiskey. It had been days since his confrontation with Isabella, and nothing had changed. She still avoided him, still acted like nothing had happened, still pretended like the way she looked at him hadn't meant something. Lucas exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He had never been one to chase after someone. But Isabella? She was the exception, and he hated that. Hated that she had somehow burrowed her way into his mind. Hated that he couldn't stop thinking about her. Hated that she was the first person he thought of when he woke up, and the last person on his mind when he fell asleep. He hated it because it meant he was losing control, and Lucas never lost control. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lucas frowned. Who the hell was still here this late? Come in, he called. The door opened and his breath hitched. Isabella stood there. She hesitated, her hand gripping the doorknob a little too tightly. Lucas leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk. Boss, shouldn't you be home by now? Isabella sighed, stepping inside. She didn't sit. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out at the city below. Lucas studied her. She looked different. Not in a physical way, she was still flawless, poised, unreadable. But there was something else. Something in her eyes, something that looked almost like uncertainty. That was new. Lucas set his whiskey down. What's on your mind? He asked, voice softer than usual. Isabella didn't turn, but she spoke. I've been thinking about that night, she admitted. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just waited. And then, finally, she turned to him. Her gaze was sharp, unwavering. Why did you defend me? She asked. Lucas blinked. At the gala? She nodded. Why did you step in? She pressed. Why did you help me? Lucas tilted his head. What kind of question is that? A real one. She stepped closer, folding her arms. You had nothing to gain from it, she continued. You could have stood by and let it happen, but you didn't. Why? Lucas frowned. He wasn't sure how to answer, because the truth was, he didn't know why, he just did. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, and he just moved. And now, staring at Isabella, he realized that he would do it again. Every single time. I don't know, he admitted, voice rough. He stopped. Isabella raised an eyebrow. You just what? Lucas exhaled. I just couldn't stand there and do nothing, he muttered. Silence stretched between them. Then Isabella did something unexpected. She laughed, not a full laugh, not loud, just a quiet, bitter chuckle. Lucas narrowed his eyes. What's so funny? Isabella shook her head. She sighed, rubbing her temple. I spent years hating you. Years thinking you were the most self-absorbed, insufferable man I had ever met. Lucas smirked. Wow, don't hold back. Isabella ignored him. But then you go and do something like that, she continued, her voice quieter now. And it messes with my head. Lucas's smirk faded. Messing with her head, was that what this was? Because she had been messing with his for weeks. Lucas leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. So, he said slowly, does that mean you don't hate me anymore? Isabella stilled. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Lucas's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure, and that was all the answer he needed. The air between them felt different after that. Not lighter, not better, just charged. Lucas didn't push her, didn't bring it up again, but he knew that Isabella was feeling exactly what he was feeling. And it was only a matter of time before one of them broke. That break came sooner than expected. It happened on a Friday night. The office was quiet. Most employees had already left, eager to start their weekend. But Lucas was still there. And so was Isabella. He found her in the boardroom, staring at the whiteboard, lost in thought. Lucas leaned against the doorframe. You work too much, he said. Isabella sighed. So do you. Lucas smirked. Yeah, but at least I make it look good. That earned him a glare. Lucas chuckled. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Isabella watched him warily. Lucas shrugged. I have a theory, he said casually. She raised an eyebrow. Oh, he nodded. I think you're avoiding me, he said. And I think it's because you're scared. Isabella scoffed. Scared, she repeated. Of you. Lucas grinned. Exactly. She rolled her eyes. Lucas, I think you feel something, he interrupted, and you don't know what to do with it. Isabella went still. Lucas took a step closer, then another, until there was barely a foot of space between them. She didn't move away, she just looked at him. And Lucas knew that if he reached for her right now, she wouldn't stop him. So he did. Slowly, cautiously, he reached up, his fingers brushing against her jaw. Isabella sucked in a sharp breath. Lucas. His name was barely a whisper. Lucas swallowed hard, his hand dropped. He took a step back, because if he didn't, He wouldn't be able to stop himself. Isabella closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, they were unreadable again. "I should go," she murmured. Lucas nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah," he said. "You should." But neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away, because deep down they both knew. It was already too late. Section 9. Isabella barely made it to her car before her hands started shaking. She gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at the parking lot, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Lucas had touched her. It had been brief, barely a caress, but it was enough. Enough to unravel everything she had worked so hard to bury. Enough to remind her of things she wasn't supposed to feel. And worst of all, she hadn't pulled away, she had let him. Her breathing was unsteady as she reached up, touching the place where his fingers had brushed her skin. It shouldn't have felt like that. It shouldn't have made her heart race, and it shouldn't have made her want more, but it did. And that terrified her, because Lucas Reed was the last man in the world she should be falling for. Lucas, meanwhile, had no idea what to do with himself. He was sitting in his office, staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, replaying the moment over and over. Isabella had looked at him like she was on the edge of something dangerous. Like if he had leaned in just a little more, she would have let him. But he hadn't. Because if he had, he wasn't sure he would have been able to stop. And Lucas Reed wasn't in the habit of losing control. Not until now. Not until her. He let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. He needed a distraction. Something to get his mind off of her. But the universe had other plans. Because just then his phone vibrated. A text from his father. "Meet me at the club, we need to talk." Lucas exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. The last thing he needed right now was a lecture from the old man. But something told him this wasn't a request. And so, reluctantly, he grabbed his keys and headed out. The Reed family's private club was one of the most exclusive in the city. It was the kind of place where deals were made over whiskey, and secrets were traded like currency. Lucas found his father in their usual spot, a corner table away from prying eyes. William Reed was a man who had built an empire from nothing, and he carried himself like it. Even now, in his late 60s, his presence commanded a room. "Lucas," he greeted, his voice as sharp as ever. Lucas slid into the seat across from him. "What's so urgent?" he asked, signaling the waiter for a drink. His father studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time with your new CEO." Lucas's fingers stilled around his glass. Of course, his father knew. "Is that a problem?" he asked evenly. William gave a short, humorless laugh. "For you, possibly." Lucas clenched his jaw. "What are you getting at?" His father sighed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I'm saying that you're playing a dangerous game," he said, "and you need to be careful." Lucas frowned. "What game?" William's gaze sharpened. "She isn't just some woman you can charm, Lucas. She's your boss. And from what I hear, she's got every reason to hate you." Lucas took a slow sip of his drink. "She doesn't hate me." His father smirked. "Doesn't she?" Lucas didn't answer, because the truth was he wasn't sure anymore. There was something between them, something neither of them seemed to be able to control, and maybe that was the problem. William leaned back, watching his son carefully. "I won't tell you how to handle this," he said, "but I will tell you this. If you make a mistake here, it won't just be your job on the line. It'll be your future." Lucas met his father's gaze. "And if she's worth it?" William let out a dry chuckle. "Then you'd better be ready to fight for it." Lucas sat there, gripping his glass, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest, because he already knew the answer. She was worth it. The question was he ready to fight for her? The next morning, Isabella walked into the office with one goal in mind: distance. She needed to separate herself from whatever the hell was happening between her and Lucas. Because this was dangerous, and this was exactly what she had spent years avoiding. So when Lucas appeared in her doorway, looking entirely too comfortable, she stiffened. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Lucas smirked. "To talk," she exhaled sharply. "We have nothing to talk about." Lucas leaned against the door frame, tilting his head. "Really, because last night was a mistake," she cut in. Lucas's expression didn't change. "Is that what you really think?" Isabella hated how calm he sounded, how unbothered, like none of this was affecting him the way it was affecting her. She folded her arms. "Yes, Lucas took a step inside, closing the door behind him, and just like that, the air in the room shifted. "You're lying," he murmured. Isabella's heart slammed against her ribs. She forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression blank. "I'm not." Lucas took another step forward. Isabella's breath caught. "Then why?" he asked, voice low. "Do you look like you're about to run?" Isabella's fingers curled into fists, because he was right, and she did want to run, because Lucas Reed was too much, too close, too dangerous. She took a deep breath, lifting her chin. "This isn't happening, Lucas." His eyes flickered. "Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because I don't trust you." The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Lucas's jaw tightened. "Then let me prove it." Isabella stared at him. "You can't," she whispered. Lucas exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. And for the first time, he looked tired, not frustrated, not cocky, just tired. "I know I screwed up," he admitted. "And I know you have every reason to hate me." Isabella stayed silent. "But," he continued, voice softer now, "I also know that what's happening between us, it's real." Isabella's breath hitched. Lucas took another step forward, closing the last bit of space between them. "If you tell me to walk away," he murmured, "I will." Isabella's pulse pounded. Her mind screamed at her to end this, to push him away. But her heart was already betraying her. And Lucas saw it, saw the way she hesitated, saw the way she wasn't saying no. So instead of waiting for an answer, he did something else. Something reckless, something that changed everything. He reached up, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. And Isabella, she let him. Section 10. Isabella's mind went blank the moment Lucas's lips touched hers. She should have pushed him away. She should have stepped back, ended this before it went too far. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned in. Instead, she let herself feel everything. The warmth of his hands on her skin. The way he kissed her like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Like he wasn't just kissing her, he was claiming her. And for one blissful second, Isabella let him. But then reality crashed in. She couldn't do this, not with him, not after everything. With a sharp inhale, she pulled away, her breath coming fast, her hands pressed against his chest to keep him at a distance. Lucas was staring at her, his blue eyes filled with something she didn't want to name, something too real, too dangerous. "I can't," she whispered. Lucas's jaw tightened. "Why?" She shook her head, stepping back. "Because I don't trust you," she said, her voice barely steady. "And I don't trust myself when I'm around you." Lucas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You're lying." Isabella's chest ached. "No, I'm protecting myself." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then Lucas did something that shattered her defenses completely. He reached for her hand, not to pull her closer, not to force her to change her mind, but just to hold it, just to let her feel the steady warmth of him. "Tell me to walk away," he murmured. "And I will." Isabella stared at him. Her throat felt tight. Her heart felt torn apart. She had spent years building herself up, creating an armor so strong that nothing could break through. And yet, Lucas was breaking through anyway. She should tell him to leave. She should, but when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Because the truth was, she didn't want him to go, and that terrified her more than anything. Lucas didn't press her for an answer. Instead, he did something unexpected. He let go of her hand, he took a step back, and then, without another word, he walked away. Isabella stood frozen, watching him go, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had told herself that pushing him away was the right thing to do, that keeping him at a distance was necessary. But as she watched him leave, it didn't feel like victory, and it felt like loss, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she could handle it. Days passed. Lucas kept his distance, and he still showed up at work. Still performed like the brilliant businessman he was, but something was different. He was colder, more detached. He didn't look at her the way he used to, didn't find excuses to talk to her, didn't challenge her, tease her, push her buttons. It was like he had flipped a switch, gone back to being the Lucas Reed she had first met. And Isabella hated it. She hated that it bothered her, hated that she missed his warmth, his teasing smirks, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. She had spent so long convincing herself that she didn't want him, but now that he was gone, she felt it, and it was unbearable. Then the scandal broke. It happened without warning, a leaked report. A series of emails that had been doctored to make it look like Isabella had sabotaged her own company. Within hours, the media had picked it up. Isabella Carter, fraud, new CEO of Carter. Industries accused of destroying her own business. Panic gripped her as she sat at her desk, scrolling through the articles, reading the vicious comments flooding in. She knew who was behind this. Nathaniel, her former stepbrother, the man who had wanted her gone from the start. He had waited for his chance, and now he had taken it. And Isabella, she was about to lose everything. Lucas found out before she even had a chance to tell him. When he stormed into her office, his rage was palpable. "Tell me you had nothing to do with this," he said, voice dangerously low. Isabella shot to her feet, her hands slamming against the desk. "Are you serious?" she hissed. "You think I would sabotage my own company?" Lucas's jaw clenched. "No," he admitted, "but that's what they're saying." She let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, welcome to the world of business, Lucas. People will believe whatever they want to believe." His gaze hardened. "You need to fight this," she scoffed. "Oh, really? And how do you suggest I do that? Go on a press tour? Beg them to believe me?" Lucas took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "No," he said. "You let me handle it." Isabella blinked. "What?" Lucas's expression was deadly serious. "I know who's behind this," he said, "and I know exactly how to destroy them." Isabella hesitated. She knew Lucas was powerful, knew he had connections, but could she really trust him? Could she trust that he wouldn't use this as a way to gain the upper hand? Lucas must have seen the doubt in her eyes because his expression softened. "I told you," he murmured. "I'm not leaving you to fight alone." Isabella swallowed hard, and for the first time in her life, she let someone stand beside her. Lucas handled it. Within 24 hours, the story was completely dismantled. He found the source of the leaks, exposed Nathaniel's scheme, and made sure the truth spread just as fast as the lies had. By the next morning, the headlines had changed. Isabella Carter cleared of all allegations. Evidence of corporate sabotage uncovered. Nathaniel was finished. And Isabella, she was free. She had won. But she had never felt more conflicted. Because the man who had saved her, the man who had fought for her, was the same man she had pushed away, and she didn't know how to fix it. That night, she found him at the rooftop bar of their office building. Lucas was leaning against the railing, a drink in hand, staring out at the city. For a moment, Isabella just watched him, took in the sharp cut of his jaw, the way the neon lights reflected in his eyes. And then, finally, she spoke. "You saved me." Lucas didn't turn around. "You didn't need saving," he said. "You just needed someone to fight for you." Isabella exhaled shakily, stepping closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Lucas finally looked at her. "For what?" She swallowed. "For pushing you away." A slow, almost sad smile curved his lips. "Are you still pushing me away?" he asked. She hesitated, then without thinking she reached for his hand, intertwined her fingers with his. Lucas's breath hitched. Isabella lifted her gaze to his, her heart hammering. "No," she said softly. "Not anymore." Lucas let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "About damn time." And then, this time, when he kissed her, she didn't pull away. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you have forgiven Lucas? See you in the next story. See you in the next story. See you in the next story. See you.